The November afternoon had wrapped the city in a soft, golden haze that seemed to slow everything down, except the steady hum inside Corner Brew, the small cafe where Hannah Cooper had quietly built her Saturday ritual, and where she now sat at her usual table by the window, her laptop open, a half-finished cappuccino cooling beside her as she chipped away at a freelance graphic design project that needed to be finished before Monday morning, the comfortable familiarity of the space wrapping around her like a well-worn sweater. At 29, Hannah had grown used to living inside gentle routines. She rented a modest apartment just 2 blocks away, worked from home most days, did her own grocery runs, paid her bills on time, and found an unexpected contentment in those quiet, predictable rhythms. The cafe had become her refuge, her second office, and the one place where her ideas seemed to flow most naturally, as if the soft music and background chatter were part of her creative process. On this particular afternoon, however, the place felt more like a beehive than a sanctuary, every table occupied, the line at the counter stretching toward the door, people clutching paper cups while they waited and casting hopeful glances at any chair that looked even remotely available. Hannah glanced around and felt a twinge of guilt about occupying a 4-person table all by herself, her laptop and notebook spread out as if she owned the corner. And just as she considered packing up to make room for someone else, she noticed him. Near the entrance stood a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, slightly rumpled in a way that suggested a long day rather than carelessness, with dark hair that seemed to have been combed by his own fingers more than a brush, and a charcoal blazer thrown over a white shirt that hinted he'd come from somewhere more formal, maybe a meeting or an office. At his side, holding tightly to his hand, was a little girl of 4 or 5 in a purple sweater, her curly brown hair framing a face that scanned the crowded cafe with wide, curious eyes. He surveyed the room with the weary alertness of a parent looking for a place to land, his daughter tugging on his hand and pointing eagerly toward something in the display case, probably a muffin or one of the elaborate cookies, her lips moving with words Hannah couldn't quite hear over the noise. And in that small flicker of a moment, before she could talk herself out of it, Hannah lifted her hand and caught his eye, then gestured toward the empty seats at her table. He hesitated, surprise flickering across his face, then smiled in clear relief and mouthed a thank you, bending down to tell his daughter something as they wove their way between tables. When they reached her, he thanked her properly, his voice warm and edged with that particular gratitude people reserve for unexpected kindness, explaining that every other place they'd tried had been just as crowded, and introducing himself as Ryan while resting a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder and telling her name, Isabel. Hannah introduced herself with an easy smile and assured him it was no trouble at all, that she'd been feeling slightly guilty about monopolizing the table, and Isabel climbed into the chair across from her with the seriousness of a child approaching a grand project, immediately pulling a small box of colored pencils and a drawing pad from the bag Ryan was carrying, arranging them with fierce concentration before beginning to draw with her tongue slightly sticking out in that way only young children manage so effortlessly. Ryan excused himself to place their order, and when he returned with a steaming hot chocolate crowned with whipped cream for Isabel and a black coffee for himself, he settled into the seat beside his daughter, one eye on her creation and the other scanning his phone, while his hand absent-mindedly smoothed her curls whenever she leaned against his arm, a tender, unconscious habit that made Hannah's chest ache in a soft, unexpected way. For a while they shared the space in a comfortable near silence, Hannah pretending to focus on her project, while her attention drifted frequently to the little scene unfolding opposite her, the laptop screen starting to feel less urgent than the small universe of father and daughter she had accidentally invited to her table. After 20 minutes or so, Isabel lifted her drawing pad with a proud flourish and turned it toward Hannah, announcing that she wanted her to see what she'd made, revealing a butterfly exploding with energetic swirls of purple, blue, and pink lines that paid little attention to anatomy, but captured joy perfectly. Hannah told her honestly that it was beautiful, and that she especially loved the colors she'd chosen, prompting Isabel to declare with great seriousness that purple was her favorite, then asking what Hannah's favorite color might be. After thinking for a moment, Hannah admitted that she loved teal, describing it as if blue and green had had a baby, which made Isabel giggle and drew Ryan's attention from his phone as he looked up with an amused grin and said he might have to steal that description, to which Hannah replied that there was no copyright on how one described colors. They drifted back into their shared quiet, but something had shifted. The space felt less like three strangers sharing a table and more like a small island of connection in a crowded room. And Hannah realized she was spending more time watching the gentle, unspoken language between Ryan and Isabel than actually working on her designs. When Isabel suddenly craned her neck to peek at Hannah's laptop and asked if she was an artist, Hannah tilted the screen and explained that she was a graphic designer, that she created images and layouts for companies and websites. And Isabel's eyes widened with awe as she declared it so cool, while Ryan, with a half smile, chimed in to say that whatever Isabel meant was that it sounded far more interesting than what her dad did. When Hannah asked what that was, he shrugged in a self-deprecating way and said it was finance. Lots of numbers, lots of meetings, very boring. And Isabel solemnly confirmed that her daddy had meetings all the time, even on Saturdays sometimes. Though not today, he added firmly, because today was just for the two of them. And the way he said it made Hannah suspect there was more to their story than he was sharing. She didn't pry. Instead, she let the conversation ebb and flow around Isabel's chatter about preschool adventures and favorite crayons, occasionally joining in, watching as Ryan patiently helped his daughter when a color wasn't turning out the way she wanted, and noticing the easy affection that moved between them with every shared glance and small touch. When Isabel announced after an hour that she needed to go to the bathroom, Ryan started to stand, but Isabel declared herself a big girl and insisted she could manage on her own, and though he ultimately allowed it, he kept his eyes fixed on the path she took and the restroom door until it closed behind her, only relaxing slightly when she'd disappeared inside. "She's wonderful," Hannah said softly, and Ryan's face lit up with a pride that needed no embellishment, as he replied that Isabel was his whole world and had been from the moment she was born. When Hannah asked gently if it was just the two of them, he nodded and told her that Isabel's mother had died from an aneurysm when their daughter was only 18 months old, with no warning and no time to prepare, one day there and the next day gone, and that since then it had been just father and daughter figuring out life together. Hannah offered the only words that felt honest. "I'm so sorry," and Ryan accepted them quietly, explaining that it had been hard, yes, but that they had found a rhythm of their own, even if it broke his heart that Isabel would grow up with only faint memories of her mother. He tried, he said, to keep that connection alive with stories and photos, and in the way he spoke, Hannah heard the fierce determination of a man who had decided his daughter would never feel unloved, even if life had taken more than its share from them. When Isabel returned, the conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but now Hannah felt like she was seeing them through a different lens, aware of the invisible weight Ryan carried, and the quiet heroism in making ordinary days feel safe and joyful for his child. As the afternoon mellowed into early evening and the crowd in the cafe thinned, Hannah's laptop remained open but forgotten. She had helped Isabel add details to her drawings, talked about her own work, and learned in the process that Ryan's supposedly boring finance job actually involved running an investment firm his father had started years earlier, though he mentioned it as if it were an embarrassing footnote rather than a point of pride. Eventually, Ryan glanced at his watch and said they should probably head home, because it was nearly dinner time, and there was a small person in need of a bath before bed, a statement Isabel met with routine protest that lacked any real conviction. As they gathered their things, Ryan turned to Hannah and thanked her again for sharing her table, and, more than that, her afternoon, saying it had been much nicer than the lonely alternative of sitting at home. She surprised herself with how deeply she meant it when she replied that she had enjoyed it too. He hesitated then, clearly weighing something in his mind, before pulling out his phone and asking, a little tentatively, if she'd be open to exchanging numbers so they could maybe do this again sometime. adding that Isabel clearly thought she was pretty great and that his daughter's judgment was usually reliable. Hannah felt a flutter in her chest and said she would like that, so they swapped numbers while Isabel gave her an enthusiastic hug, then slipped her hand into her father's as he opened the door for her and led her out into the early evening light. Hannah sat back down at the now empty table, her laptop blinking patiently, and realized she was smiling to herself, struck by how a day that had started with nothing more than a crowded cafe and a free chair had somehow rearranged something inside her. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a text from Ryan, explaining that Isabel wanted to know if Miss Hannah might like to join them at the Children's Museum next Saturday. No pressure, but their daughter had already told 3 people about her new friend. Hannah laughed out loud and replied that she'd love to, and that promise marked the beginning of a new pattern in her life. At the museum that weekend, she watched Ryan crawl through exhibits with Isabel, make ridiculous faces to coax giggles out of her, and treat every question with respect, while also making sure Hannah felt included, asking her opinion, sharing quiet smiles with her when Isabel said something unexpectedly insightful or hilarious. Over the weeks that followed, their outings multiplied almost without conscious planning. Museum visits turned into long walks in the park. Those walks turned into movie afternoons and pizza dinners. And somewhere along the way, Hannah realized that she was thinking about Ryan at odd moments, recalling the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed or how carefully he listened when she talked, and that she had fallen completely for Isabel, who now called her Miss Hannah and barreled into her arms for hugs whenever they met. 2 months after their first shared table, Ryan invited her to dinner at his home, promising to cook and warning her with mock seriousness that his skills in the kitchen were limited but earnest. When Hannah arrived at the address he'd sent, she paused on the sidewalk, taken aback by the sleek, modern house in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, its clean lines and meticulous landscaping quietly announcing a level of success far beyond anything she'd imagined when he'd described his job as finance stuff. When he opened the door, Isabel bouncing excitedly at his side, he asked if she'd found the place easily, and she blurted out that he hadn't mentioned living somewhere like this. He looked almost shy as he asked if it mattered, and Hannah, after a moment's honest reflection, realized the answer was no, it didn't, because the man in front of her was still the same dad who carried colored pencils in his bag, laughed at bad puns, and knelt on museum floors to explore the world at his daughter's eye level. Dinner was simple, pasta and salad, but it tasted perfect, flavored by easy conversation and Isabel's steady commentary. And afterward, when Isabel went to her room to play, Hannah and Ryan sat on the back patio watching the sun dip behind the city skyline. Ryan said he needed to be honest about something, and Hannah's heart clenched, bracing for a revelation that might pull the ground from under her. He told her that he wasn't just someone who worked in finance, that he actually ran Whitmore Capital, a multi-million-dollar firm with a name she recognized from news articles and financial magazines, and admitted that he had been afraid to tell her because people often changed when they learned how much money he had. They started focusing on the wealth instead of the person, and the last 2 months with her had been the most normal and real time he'd experienced in years. Hannah took his hand and said she wouldn't pretend the money didn't surprise her, because it did, but that it didn't change how she saw him. To her, he was still the dad who knew all of Isabel's stuffed animals by name, the man who carried crayons in his briefcase, the person who had sat across from her in a crowded cafe and talked openly about love and loss. And that was the version of him she loved getting to know. His eyes shone with emotion, and when he asked if he could be honest in return, she admitted that she was falling in love with him and with Isabel, and that the feeling terrified her because she had built a small, safe life for herself, and now he was asking her, without saying it in so many words, to step into something larger, riskier, but also more beautiful than she had ever dared to picture. Ryan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, confessing that he was terrified too because he hadn't let anyone this close to Isabel since her mother's death and had guarded their little world fiercely, but that Hannah had brought light back into their home. Isabel laughed more when she was around, and so did he, and the house felt fuller, warmer, alive in a way it hadn't for a very long time. At that exact moment, Isabel appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, and asked in a small but clear voice if Miss Hannah was going to be her new mommy. Ryan immediately tried to respond, but Hannah gently held up a hand and called Isabel over, letting the little girl climb into her lap as she explained carefully that she cared very much about both her and her daddy, and wanted to spend more time with them, but that becoming a mommy was something big and important. And just like their friendship, it should grow slowly and steadily. First they had shared a table, then they had visited the museum, then they'd had all sorts of adventures together, and in the same way, their family could grow step by step. Isabel's eyes filled with worry as she asked if Hannah would stay, if she would go away like others had, and Hannah, feeling tears sting her own eyes, promised that she wasn't going anywhere, that she planned to stay in their lives. That reassurance seemed to ease something in the little girl, and later, when Ryan walked Hannah to her car, he thanked her for how she had handled the moment, acknowledging that Isabel had already known too much loss and fear of people leaving. Hannah said that, of course, she was worried, and that they would simply have to prove to her day after day that they were there to stay, and when Ryan repeated the word "we" with a quiet smile, he admitted that he liked how it sounded. They married the following spring in Ryan's backyard, under a soft canopy of white lights and early blossoms, with family and close friends gathered to witness a moment that felt both intimate and monumental. Isabel, as flower girl, took her responsibility so seriously that she walked down the makeshift aisle with precise, measured steps, scattering petals with intense concentration. When the officiant reached the part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone objected, Isabel piped up loudly that she did not object at all, that she wanted Miss Hannah to be her mommy, and the guests laughed warmly while Hannah cried happy tears that felt like the release of a lifetime of waiting for something she hadn't known she needed. In the years that followed, Hannah never forgot how the entire story had begun, not with a grand romantic gesture or a planned meeting, but with a crowded cafe, an empty chair, and a simple, generous decision to share her table with a stranger and his little girl. She had had no idea that the man in the charcoal blazer ran a powerful firm, no idea that the child with the purple sweater and colored pencils would one day call her Mom, no idea that one small act of kindness would reroute the entire trajectory of her life. Ryan liked to joke that turning into Corner Brew that afternoon had been the best investment he had ever made, while Hannah liked to remind him that the best things in life could never truly be quantified or predicted, that they showed up in moments of connection and openness, in the choice to make space for someone else at your table and, by extension, in your heart. As Isabel grew older and more curious about her origins, she would ask her mother if she had known that her dad was rich when she let them sit down that day, and Hannah would answer honestly that she hadn't, that all she had seen was a father and his daughter who needed somewhere to sit together. When Isabel asked if she was glad she had said yes, Hannah would hug her close and tell her that letting them share that table had been the best decision she had ever made, not because of money or houses or anything material, but because in that single, ordinary moment she had found the two people who would become her family and had stepped into a life filled with more love than she had imagined possible. Every year on their anniversary, Ryan took Hannah and Isabel back to Corner Brew, and if the table by the window was free, they sat there and remembered that Saturday afternoon when the cafe was packed, the seats were scarce, and Hannah had chosen to make room for two strangers, unknowingly opening the door to the rest of her life. They talked about how sometimes the most extraordinary love stories are born not from grand entrances or sweeping gestures, but from simple acts of generosity and a willingness to say, "You can sit here." Hannah had once thought of herself as someone who worked at a table for one, but that day, by inviting them to join her, she had found her place at a table for three, surrounded by laughter, inside jokes, tears, celebrations, and the everyday magic of a family she hadn't even known she'd been waiting for. If this story touched your heart or reminded you how powerful a simple act of kindness can be, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. and subscribe to the channel for more long emotional stories about love, family, and the unexpected moments that change everything.